Okay, so you're interested in Australia, huh? Specifically, you want to know about these proposed caps on international students? Well, you've come to the right place.
It's a hot topic, that's for sure.
It is. We're going to really dissect this commentary by Anthony Welch.
Oh, yeah, I know Welch.
He's a professor at the University of Sydney.
Right.
And this piece was published in CNA, and it gets right to the heart of the potential impacts of these proposed caps, which, as you probably know, is a big deal because Australia has this long history of welcoming international
Yeah,
students,
for decades, really.
especially from places like China and India. They've
No.
been a major part of the higher education scene down under.
Huge part. And it's been good for Australia, both academically and, of course, economically. But there's this tension brewing, because of how reliant Australian universities have become on international student fees.
Yeah, it's not like the Australian government has been showering their universities with cash, right?
Yeah. No, not exactly. They've had to turn to international student fees more and more to cover basic stuff like research and just keeping the lights on. In 2019, international education brought in a whopping 27 billion US dollars for Australia.
Oh, hold on. 27 billion.
Yep, 27 billion. It was their fourth largest export.
That's incredible. It just shows you how huge this whole sector is for their economies. So I got to ask, with all that money coming in, why are they even considering these caps in the first place?
Well, there's this rising anxiety in Australia. People are concerned about things like migration, the cost of housing, and even some shenanigans with the student visa system. There were actually two national inquiries, and they found some, let's say, creative practices going on, like ghost schools, where they were basically selling visas, but not really providing any real education.
Sounds like a scam.
Yeah, pretty much. So the government had to step in and crack down to make sure their education system wasn't being exploited. But, you know, while some folks point the finger at international students for driving up housing costs, most of them actually head back home after they graduate.
Right, so they're not putting down permanent roots or anything. Okay, but this whole situation still seems pretty messy. What's Welch's take on these proposed caps? What's he saying?
Welch is definitely raising the alarm. He's basically saying that these caps could really hurt Australian universities, especially the ones that are known for their big research programs. Those universities really depend on those international student fees.
He uses the term financial viability. Can you break that down for us non-economists?
Basically, he's saying that some universities might struggle to, keep the doors open without that income from international students. It's like any business, really. You got to have enough money coming in to cover your expenses or you go under.
So limiting those fees could create this ripple effect through the whole system. What kind of economic damage are we talking about here?
Well, estimates suggest that the Australian economy has already lost about 4.3 billion Australian dollars just in the last 6 months.
Wow.
And if these caps actually happen, we could be looking at something like 14,000 jobs lost. To put it into perspective, international student spending accounted for over half of Australia's total economic growth in 2023.
Half. That's massive. So limiting international students is almost like, I don't know, cutting off a major artery for their economy.
Exactly. And this isn't just theoretical. Canada tried something similar when they cut back on study permits, and guess what happened? Students just decided to study somewhere else. It caused a lot of financial problems for Canadian institutions.
So Australia could be making the same mistake.
That's what a lot of people are worried about. There are unintended consequences to think about. At the end of the day, students have choices, and they're going to choose countries that are welcoming and offer great educational opportunities. It's a global competition out there, and Australia needs to stay in the game.
That's a good point. And speaking of competition, it seems like this whole thing is sending mixed messages when it comes to Australia's relationships with other countries.
Yeah, it's definitely complicated. You have to remember that a lot of Australia's international students come from South and Southeast Asia. And, Australia's been trying to build stronger ties with those countries.
But if they're making it harder for students from those regions to study there, it kind of goes against those efforts, right?
Exactly. It makes you wonder if they're willing to risk those relationships just to implement these caps.
Welch even mentioned some pushback, especially in the Indian media. People are worried that Australia is becoming less welcoming. It's kind of like what happened back in 2009 with those attacks on Indian students in Australia.
Right. Those incidents did a lot of damage to Australia's reputation. Indian student enrollment really took a hit. It took years to rebuild that trust. So yeah, people are definitely concerned about history repeating itself.
It seems like the Australian government is trying to, I don't know, get a tighter grip on the higher education sector. I mean, they're even talking about creating a whole new body to oversee it all.
Oh, you mean the Australian Tertiary Education Commission? Yeah, the ATEC. It would have a lot of power, potentially even setting limits on international student numbers at specific universities and even dictating which fields of study they can enroll in.
So more control for the government, huh? Sounds like they're taking a more hands-on approach to this situation.
Definitely. The level of control ATEC could have is pretty unprecedented. It remains to be seen how this new body would operate and what impact it would actually have on universities and international students. They're even thinking about trying to incentivize international students to go into areas like teaching and nursing where they're short on qualified people.
It makes sense, trying to steer students toward fields that need more people. But I wonder how effective that would actually be.
It's a tough question. Students usually have their own career goals in mind, and they might not be swayed by incentives, especially if it means giving up their preferred programs or universities.
So we've got this whole web of interconnected things going on here. Economics, politics, education, international relations, and now this new level of government oversight. It's a lot to wrap your head around. What's standing out to you so far?
I think what's most interesting is how deeply entwined international education is with so many different aspects of Australian life. It's not just about, filling up classrooms. It's about their economy, their global standing, even their social dynamics. And these proposed caps could really mess with that balance.
It seems like there are a lot of potential downsides to these caps. But what are some of the potential upsides that the government might be considering?
That's a great question, and it's one we'll dig into in the next part of our deep dive. We'll look at some of the arguments for caps and see if they actually outweigh the risks. It's important to consider all sides before we jump to any conclusions.
Stay with us as we untangle this complicated situation. There's still so much to explore.
All right, so where were we? Yes, those potential upsides to these caps on international students in Australia. Like we said, every story has two sides.
Exactly. We talked about the economic worries, but what are some of the arguments in favor of these caps?
Well, one big argument is about this over-reliance on international students. Some folks think Australian universities have become too dependent on those fees, and it could be hurting academic standards. They're worried about universities focusing too much on money instead of education quality.
So it's like they're saying that the priority has shifted from actually educating students to just filling seats and collecting those fees.
Yeah, kind of. The critics are saying this dependence on international student fees could lead to a drop in education quality because universities might start prioritizing quantity over quality just to keep the money flowing.
It's funny, though, because we always hear about how international students bring so much to the table. Different perspectives, cultural richness, all that.
Oh, absolutely. That's a huge part of what makes international education so valuable. But the worry is that if universities get too hooked on those fees, they might not invest as much in things that benefit all students, including domestic students.
So it's all about finding that sweet spot, right? Where universities are financially stable, but also committed to providing a top-notch education for everyone, no matter where they come from.
Exactly. It's about making sure everyone wins, not just the bottom line.
What about the concerns people have about housing affordability and the impact on local communities? Are those legitimate arguments for caps?
There are definitely valid concerns. Like we talked about before, most international students go back home after they finish their studies, but there's still a big wave of students coming in every year, and that can put a strain on the housing market, especially in big cities like Sydney and Melbourne.
Yeah, it's a common issue in places that attract a lot of international students. Rent goes up, it's harder to find a place to live, and locals start to feel the pressure.
For sure. And we need to acknowledge those concerns and find ways to lessen the impact on those communities. Some people think that caps could help with that by slowing down the flow of incoming students.
But wouldn't that go against the idea of attracting global talent and building those international relationships we were discussing earlier?
Yeah, there's definitely a trade-off there. And that's what makes this whole thing so tricky. It's about weighing the potential benefits of caps against the potential downsides and finding a way forward that aligns with Australia's long-term goals.
It sounds like there's no simple solution here. It's all about making tough decisions and finding that balance between different priorities.
Exactly. And it requires a really nuanced approach, one that recognizes the concerns of local communities, but also acknowledges the value that international students bring to Australia.
Speaking of value, how do people who support caps address those concerns about Australia's soft power and its relationships in the region?
That's where things get a little more Interesting. Some people who support caps actually argue that they could give Australia more leverage in talks about trade and diplomacy with other countries.
So it's like they're saying, hey, if you want access to our awesome education system, you got to play by our rules.
Yeah, it's kind of a power play, and it's not clear if it would actually work.
It seems risky. Those countries could just go somewhere else, right?
Exactly. It could really backfire and damage all the goodwill that Australia has built up in the region.
This whole debate seems to be about more than just economics and education. It's almost like it's about Australia's identity as a nation. What kind of country do they want to be?
That's a big question, and it gets to the core of this issue. Does Australia want to be seen as a welcoming, inclusive country that embraces global talent and encourages cultural exchange? Or do they want to put their own interests first, even if it means pushing away potential partners and hurting their global reputation?
Those are tough questions. So let's say Australia does decide to go ahead with these caps. What would that look like? Would it be like a blanket cap across all universities and all fields of study?
It's probably not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. The government has been talking about a more targeted approach, maybe setting different caps for different universities in different fields.
So some universities might be allowed to take in more international students than others, and then maybe they'd prioritize certain fields.
That's the general idea. It would give the government more control over who benefits from international student enrollment and let them steer students toward areas they consider important for the country.
Makes sense strategically, but it also raises questions about fairness and transparency, right?
Definitely. How would they decide on those caps? What criteria would they use? Would the process be fair and open? Those are all questions that need answers.
Sounds like there are a lot of details that still need to be worked out. And what about the ATEC, that new commission we were talking about? Would they be involved in setting and enforcing these caps?
That's a big question. Like we said before, the ATEC would have a lot of sway over the higher education sector. It's possible they'd be in charge of managing these caps, which would add another layer of complexity to this whole thing.
So there's a lot of uncertainty about how this would all actually work. It's a pretty complicated situation with a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, it definitely is. And the stakes are high. The decisions they make now will have a big impact down the road, shaping the future of education in Australia, their economy, and even their place in the world.
What does this all mean for everyday Australians? How could these changes affect their lives?
That's a great question, and it's one we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. We're going to shift our focus from the big picture to the individual level and look at how these proposed caps could impact people's lives, their communities, and the overall social fabric of Australia.
Okay, so we've really dug into the potential economic and political fallout from these proposed caps on international students. But now I want to shift gears a bit and think about like the average person in Australia. How could these proposed changes actually affect their daily lives?
That's where it gets really fascinating because these ripple effects, they go way beyond just the universities, They touch the very fabric of Australian society.
Yeah, Welch doesn't really get into that in his piece, does he?
No, not directly, but he does touch on a really important point, the cultural contributions that international students bring. Think about it. They bring all these different perspectives, languages, traditions. It really enriches the cultural landscape of Australia.
It's true. When I was in university, some of my best friends were international students. I learned so much from them about their cultures, and they were always so curious about mine. It really opened my eyes to the world.
Exactly. That's the kind of experience that could be lost if there are fewer international students around. Those classrooms might not be as diverse. There might be fewer opportunities for people to connect with different cultures. And the social scene, it just wouldn't be as vibrant.
So it's not just about the economics and the politics. It's about the whole social fabric of Australia.
Exactly. And it goes beyond the students themselves. A lot of them end up staying in Australia after they graduate. They bring their skills and talents to the workforce. They become active members of their communities.
Yeah, they're not just passing through. They could become future citizens who make lasting contributions.
Absolutely. And those contributions, they're not just economic. Think about healthcare, education, the arts. International students often bring fresh ideas, new ways of thinking that can benefit everyone.
Makes you wonder what Australia might miss out on if those voices are quieted or reduced.
Yeah, that's the risk.
Yeah.
These caps could limit the flow of talent and ideas, and that could stifle innovation and progress in a lot of different areas.
It's like shutting the door on a world of possibilities.
In a way, yeah. And it's not just about losing talent, it's about the message it sends to the rest of the world.
What do you mean?
Well, if Australia starts to seem less welcoming to international students, it could hurt their reputation as an open, inclusive society. That could have consequences for tourism, for foreign investment, even for their diplomatic relationships.
So it's like a domino effect.
Yeah,
One decision leads to all these other consequences.
exactly. And it's hard to predict or control all of those consequences.
So the Australian government is in a tough spot, huh? How do you balance those worries about migration and housing with the benefits of international education and the desire to maintain a good image on the world stage?
Yeah, it's a real balancing act, that's for sure. There's no easy answer. It takes a lot of careful thought and consideration, and they're going to have to make some difficult choices.
What would you say is the most important thing for them to keep in mind as they grapple with this issue?
I think the most important thing is to remember that this is about people. It's about the lives of those international students who are investing in their education and their future, and it's about the impact they have on Australian society as a whole.
It's about finding a solution that works for everyone, not just a select few.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between national interests and global engagement, between being pragmatic and being socially responsible.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to chew on today. This deep dive has really shown just how complex this issue is.
It really has, and it highlights the importance of having these conversations, of making informed decisions. The choices made today will have a lasting impact on Australia, on their economy, their society, their place in the world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listeners will walk away with?
I hope they remember that this isn't just some abstract political or economic debate. It's a human story. It's about the hopes and dreams of those international students, about the contributions they make to Australia, and about how these decisions will touch countless lives.
It's a good reminder that even the most complicated issues are ultimately about people. And it's a call for all of us to approach this debate with empathy, with understanding, and with a genuine desire to find solutions that benefit everyone. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've gained some valuable insights and a deeper understanding of this complex issue.